What is going on, everyone? Phil here, and welcome to KO Gaming for my review of Mass Effect Andromeda. You know, the Mass Effect series has been one of my favorite franchises of the previous console generation, and my playthroughs of those first three games ended up getting me the major notoriety that I have on YouTube and allowed me to eventually do this as a job, so it's been a pretty good series for me when it comes to Let's Plays. When it was announced 2 years ago that Mass Effect Andromeda would be continuing on with the franchise, but taking on new characters in a new part of the universe, although you would have some familiar faces in regards to the races and such, you would basically have a brand new cast that you would be following, I thought, wow, this is a great idea. In particular, after the very negative reception that the ending of Mass Effect 3 got, this is a good way to kind of reboot the series and allow everyone to continue on with a franchise that they really enjoyed, and a lot of people hold close to their hearts. And then the game released, and all of a sudden, it seemed like all of that hype and expectation and the love of that franchise was kind of met with horror, disappointment, shock, and just a feeling of ultimate kind of emptiness. Because when you play Mass Effect Andromeda, ladies and gents, you can definitely tell from the first hour of gameplay that this game was made by a completely different development team than the first trilogy. Now, in a lot of cases, that's okay. You can look at franchises like Halo that have been transferred from one team to another, and in a lot of cases, people like that those series are continuing, even though they do have a different feel to them. But the things that I'm talking about aren't necessarily design change choices, but more just polish, refinement, animations. I mean, it's pretty bad when you have a new game that comes out to continue a series and the animations of the characters' faces aren't even as good as those of the original trilogy that was some 10 years ago. There's a lot to be desired in Mass Effect Andromeda, and even though the game developers attempted to patch this game midway through the month of its release to try to say that they were going to fix issues, sadly by the time that I completed my 30-hour playthrough, I just felt empty and disappointed. In this review, I'm going to outline some of the things that are different from Mass Effect Andromeda and the original trilogy. Some are good, some are bad. I'm going to tell you about some of my biggest disappointments and ultimately whether or not this is a game you should check out, in particular if you're already a fan of the franchise and are wondering if it's worth your time. Andromeda takes place in a different location and time period. Groups of different races from the Mass Effect franchise, including humans, Solarians, Krogans, Turians, and Asari, have loaded up into ships called Arks in a last-ditch effort to save their races, as they've basically thrown in the towel on the Milky Way and are looking to move across the galaxy and repopulate in a different area. And so the game opens with all hell breaking loose, things aren't going according to plan, you have to basically try to find out what the hell is going on after waking up from cryo sleep. Things are not as you expected them to be when you awaken, and after a whirlwind 2-hour intro, you finally come to the main plot of the game. You are the Pathfinder, the person that has to find a way to save all of these races, and also to find the missing arcs of other alien races that are lost in space because they were supposed to show up at one point and they weren't there when you woke up. You also have to find planets for these races to populate, and eventually find a way to settle outposts on those planets to get a foothold in the galaxy so that you can start to raise crops and repopulate, etc., etc. The premise of the game is quite interesting, and right off the bat you're going to notice some things in the game that are very similar to the original Mass Effect trilogy, such as having these multi-branched dialogue options which allow you to kind of say things in a different way and experiment with maybe the personality of your character. You're also going to have many different characters you're going to be interacting and recruiting to your team. As the Pathfinder, you're going to be going throughout the galaxy, and you're going to need a wide variety of talents from your crew in order to be able to survive both in combat but also in social situations and things like that. There's also a unique amount of side content that comes out of that cast that's really fun. So it's pretty much very similar to the original Mass Effect franchise in that regard. Andromeda still remains mainly a cover-based shooter with RPG elements, but the combat is probably going to be about half of what you're going to spend your time in, so let's talk about what's different between Andromeda and the original Mass Effect trilogy. First of all, yes, there is a cover-based system, but you can no longer snap to cover by pressing a certain button. Instead, it's an automatic mechanic where when you move towards something that's supposed to be cover, your character will automatically get behind it, you can then peek over it to fire or even blind fire, and then you can move from cover to cover using a certain button. There's also a button that allows you to dash dash back and forth, and you can jump super high so that you have a lot more maneuverability in combat than ever before. However, ultimately I find that this new system kind of falls short, mostly because the automatic cover-based system is wonky. It doesn't always work the way that you intend. Sometimes you want to get behind cover and you can't. You just won't get behind it for some reason. Like, get back there, god damn it. And they won't do it. Sometimes you'll think something's cover and it ends up not being good enough for cover, and you end up getting your shield shot apart before you even get a single shot off. I strongly recommend, if you're going to play this game, to go into the tech development tree and get this little artificial barrier wall that you could put down to basically create artificial cover anywhere in the game, because the cover system is so damned wonky and frustrating. This is going to make the game a much better combat experience for you. Ultimately, I used it and basically never really had that much of an issue with cover until a few moments where enemies were literally would spawn behind me or to my sides, in which case I would just get shot and executed cheaply from behind, and there's not much you can do about that. That's just poor gameplay design right there. When it comes to the actual gunplay, it's pretty much identical or very close to the original series, but one major thing that they took away here was the ability to control your AI teammates, and that's not an exaggeration. You can no longer control your team to do any kind of combos or anything, which was kind of some of the original fun of the original Mass Effect trilogy. No longer can you have one person throw out a biotic and stun all the enemies while another one throws a grenade that blows up and does area of effect damage while you unload your rifle into them. No, now you're just basically 3 lone gunmen out there that are running around. You gotta hope that the AI does its job, when most of the time, sadly, it doesn't. I've had times when my AI-controlled teammates were just firing into walls or waiting to use their big abilities and then walking behind cover and trying to use it and missing completely. It really is sad that the AI is so bad in this game and that you cannot do combos anymore. You can kind of direct them where to go and point to different objectives or tell them to focus on an enemy, but ultimately that big control that you felt you had in the original trilogy is gone, and that's just a really odd design choice. Now, the other major thing about combat that's different is that you have the ability to develop many different weapons in the game through a crafting system. So instead of just relying on finding a weapon on the ground, you can actually find blueprints or get different research documents and or resources throughout the game that you can use to develop various different sniper rifles, shotguns, assault rifles, and handguns that have different capabilities. For example, maybe one will use your shields, but it has double damage. Maybe one has big penetration. I've had one that actually had unlimited ammo, but you had to wait a little bit for it to regenerate. So it has that little bit of variation, and ultimately, if you're into the gunplay so much, you want to develop the best weapon, you will find some overpowered things in the game, like automatic shotguns, but for the most part, it ends up feeling like really generic third-person shooter fare, and removing the ability to do those combo abilities with your teammates seems to take away that one unique thing about the Mass Effect combat that felt interesting and different. I don't know what the hell they were thinking. But for many, it's really not about the combat when it comes to the Mass Effect franchise, but more about the exploration and space mechanic that makes it an interesting game franchise. So how is that fair in Andromeda? Well, unlike other Mass Effect games, after your 2 or so hour intro, you're going to be able to go out and explore many different planets in the galaxy. It starts off with 3 main ones, of which you can explore in any order, and they vary greatly. One is kind of a ice planet, one is more of kind of a desert-like planet, one is a jungle, and as you go to these planets and you explore, you're going to be able to find different NPCs that are going to be asking you to do different chores, like, oh, please go find this item that I lost, please go find out what happened to these people that are missing. And ultimately, sadly, it feels a lot like many other open world games as of late, where it's just a bunch of kind of generic grinding style gameplay that doesn't necessarily add to the plot or anything significant in the game. It's just meant there to be busy work so that they can say that they tacked on more hours of gameplay to the total playtime of the game, even though it's really not necessary for you to do. Ultimately, all the planets in Mass Effect Andromeda end up feeling empty, because the vast majority of them is empty space where you're going to be driving in your vehicle, the Nomad, which is very reminiscent to the vehicle, the Mako, from the original Mass Effect game. You're going to eventually run into some outposts where you may fight some generic enemies or whatever, but for the most part, you're really just driving around doing quick objectives here and there, and then you're driving back across the map again. One of the weirdest things about the open world exploration is that there's certain areas that allow you to solve Sudoku puzzles in order to progress and unlock the puzzle or mystery of that area, which just baffles my mind that they literally couldn't invent their own puzzle system. They had to steal one that was blatantly already existed for this game. If that doesn't kind of show you the breadth of experience of this game development team, I really don't know what does. But ultimately, even though they added all of this open world exploration to Mass Effect Andromeda, it ends up feeling very shallow and very empty. There's so many side missions, you don't know which ones are eventually going to lead to something that's worthwhile or something that ultimately is going to feel like you ended up wasting a ton of time doing. And in fact, that's what happened to me when I first started exploring the planets and I got to the ice planet. I did the vast majority of side content only to find out that about 80% of it was completely unnecessary, didn't give me anything significant to advance my party or my characters, didn't really add to the story. It was just me doing busy work on this planet that I could have completely skipped over and missed nothing. And that's the sad thing about Mass Effect Andromeda. You'll probably hear people out there saying, oh, this game's 60 to 80 hours long, but in reality, the only meaningful content in the game would add up to maybe around 20 hours, and the rest of it is all just boring, grinding crap that's found in many other open world games of the modern era. This kind of sucks. A lot of days, it's quantity over quality, and I don't agree with that. If you just make a game that has a good cast, a main plot that you're going to enjoy, and maybe some side missions like the original Mass Effect trilogy, you don't need to have all this padding and all this grinding, but that's not what they were going for with Andromeda, and that's one of the major disappointments. So what about the story of Mass Effect Andromeda then? Does that make up for the grinding open world content that sucks and the combat that's underwhelming? Well, the main plot of the game can be beaten in around 8 to 10 hours. If you just focus on those main priority missions and ignore everything else, it pretty much can be run right through without much difficulty at all. And the story is very reminiscent to that of Mass Effect 2. I won't tell you how because I obviously don't want to spoil the plot line, but you will be running into many different comrades who you'll recruit to your team. And yes, you'll have different situations and plot mysteries and things that'll be answered by the end of the game. And yes, of course, there's a cliffhanger ending because they want to try to make a sequel. All of this is to be expected from the Mass Effect franchise. But one of the things that's pretty disappointing is that you only encounter one new friendly race and one new enemy race. And that's it. There's only 2 new races in Mass Effect Andromeda, and for a series that's supposed to be rebooting in a new part of the galaxy to only run into 2 different new kinds of aliens is kind of unexpected and kind of disappointing. I thought, hey, we're in a whole new area, we'll run into tons of new stuff, and in reality, you don't actually do that. Now, what about your crew? One of the main focuses of the Mass Effect franchise are the loyalty missions that allow them to become friendly with you and unlock better abilities, and of course the ability to romance certain crew members as well. Well, all of that is present in Mass Effect Andromeda, although I do have to say sadly that a lot of these loyalty missions again aren't very interesting. Oh, go to a certain base and save a family member that's been kidnapped. Oh, go to a certain base and save a contact that's in trouble. Oh, go to a certain base and... You see my point? It's all kind of the same deal. While in the previous Mass Effect games, the loyalty missions were varied, in this game, they're almost all identical. And that's a really sad thing that they couldn't really get out of that kind of boxed-in formula. And it honestly just feels like busy work in order to unlock the best ability rather than like you're actually getting better camaraderie with your crew. As for the romancing, yes, it's present. There's dialogue trees through the game that you can use to unlock more familiarity with your characters and get their backstories. Some of them you even get to meet their family members, which is kind of cool. And yes, no matter what sex you are, you can have a bisexual relationship, a homosexual, a heterosexual, a trisexual relationship if you may be, with multiple different alien races. However, once you lock into one relationship, just like previous Mass Effect games, you cannot move forward with any others. So once you finally get to lovemaking, that's it. You're kind of pigeonholed in, and you have to do another playthrough to do another relationship. Therefore, I strongly recommend that you're careful about who you romance, because if you end up romancing the wrong person, you may end up screwing yourself for that playthrough and have to completely replay it from the start. Ultimately, the plot and the missions with the characters, the loyalty and the romancing, it's there. It's not bad. I actually thought they could have done way worse with the main plot and this kind of stuff with the characters, which is why I made it a point to actually complete it before I finished the game. But ultimately, I do think that the other games, in particular Mass Effect 2, by far did the plotline and the loyalty missions much better than this game. And again, when you're rebooting a franchise, you're trying to do better than the original trilogy. This came up short, and that's a disappointment as well. Now, there is a multiplayer component to Andromeda, however, it feels ultimately tacked on and not very interesting. All it is you teaming up with a couple other people over the internet to fight endless hordes of AI that come at you. Once you succeed, you unlock some in-game resources for crafting and the like, and ultimately it's not very interesting. It seems like it really is just tacked on there to say that there's multiplayer in the game, when it really isn't a focus and doesn't add anything. And speaking of the crafting, I do have to say one major negative for me is that even though I played the game for 30 hours, hours and did a bunch of side content, I found that this new crafting system to make weapons and actually to upgrade your Nomad vehicle so you can climb easier in this open world ended up being underwhelming because you never seem to have enough resources to get the good stuff that you want. It almost seems like they want you to play this crappy, repetitive, meaningless multiplayer in order to get enough resources to get the good stuff in the game. I didn't do so. I only played it twice. Once it crashed after 45 seconds, and the next time I was so bored I quit halfway through the match, and I never played it again. So ultimately, the multiplayer is completely superfluous to the game, doesn't need to be there, and doesn't even really need to be spoken about in the review. And so at the end of the day, Andromeda just seems to be kind of a pale comparison to the original Mass Effect trilogy, and you may say, well, it's made by a different dev team anyway, what's all the hoopla about? Well, ultimately, I think even though I've talked about a lot of negatives so far in this review, I haven't hit upon the thing that most people absolutely hate about this game, and the reason why this game has almost become the laughingstock of the internet over the past month. It's one of the most unpolished gameplay experiences I think I've ever seen. The facial animations are god-awful. I mean, way worse than the original Mass Effect trilogy. A lot of these characters, their facial features don't even move when they talk. Their eyeballs look like they're staring into space or they're bugging out. They don't look human. They look freakishly deformed or weird. There's really no one in the game that's good looking in that regard. At least there were a few good looking characters in the previous Mass Effect games. I don't know what happened in this one. A lot of characters just seem like their faces are completely paralyzed, like they had a freaking stroke or something. It's bizarre to say the least, and even after EA tried to patch this game and say that, oh, it's fixed, it really wasn't. It still looks really bad. It's jarring during a cutscene when you're trying to stare at someone's face and it looks like a poor animatronic from like the It's a Small World ride at Disneyland rather than a human who's trying to talk to you. I don't get what happened there, and still there's been no real explanation as to why the facial animations are so bad. But there's also the fact that this game is chock full of bugs. I'm talking characters launching into the sky like Superman, characters being sucked through walls, massive audio glitches like your character talking like he's wearing a helmet when he's not. It's just jarring because there was some sessions where I would only play for 2 to 3 hours and I would have a span of an hour of crazy ass glitches back to back to back to back, just leading to everyone watching along with me on the stream kind of laughing hysterically saying, is this seriously a AAA game release and am I supposed to take this seriously? And listen, not to say that previous installments of Mass Effect didn't have bugs. The original trilogy did. In fact, Mass Effect 1 was a buggy mess where there were a few game-breaking glitches that could make you replay upwards of an hour of gameplay if they happened. But this is a new reboot of the franchise. It's the continuation. This is supposed to be the 4th game in the series, not the 1st. This kind of issue should have been worked out in development and not be present in the final game. And the fact that you can find so many different instances of bugs and glitches in Andromeda is completely unacceptable for a full $60 retail purchase. And it does need to be said that in this particular time, this year of 2017, there have been many other open world roaming games that had just as much content as Andromeda that didn't have nearly as many bugs or issues and just had much more meaningful content. I mean, just off the top of my head, games like Neo or Zelda Breath of the Wild, both games with tons of content in them, but they didn't have all these kind of production issues and they didn't feel crazy unpolished like Andromeda does. You can't have a game like this come out in a climate where there's so many good AAA games being released. It makes this game look like an embarrassment, and sadly that's what it feels like. Like, Mass Effect is back, but they flubbed it completely. They fumbled the ball, and now I'm wondering what's the fate of this series going to be when most people who've played this game have made fun of it rather than enjoyed it. And yes, there are going to be a group of people who like it. There's very many of my viewers who said they loved the game. You know, even though it had shortcomings, they kind of looked past them and still got a good 60 plus hours of gameplay out of the game, and that's still a good positive thing to say. Yeah, you can get a lot of gameplay out of it, but how much of that was meaningful? And how many other games could you have been playing that were better? And that's kind of the point I'm making. In another year where things were slower, maybe Mass Effect Andromeda would have been held in higher regard, but the fact that you've got an original trilogy of games that in a lot of ways was better than this new installment, and this new installment came out at a time when there's a ton of other great games just as long, if not more content than Andromeda that's more meaningful and a lot more fun, that's a big issue. So ultimately, all factors considered, I give Mass Effect Andromeda a 6.75 out of 10. It's certainly not a horrible game. It's a functional game. Yes, it is in times fun to play if you can get past the boring grinding, the combat that's kind of wonky and not really satisfying, and the fact that it's an unpolished mess. If you can see past all of that and just focus on the core gameplay mechanics and the story, you'll probably end up enjoying it. You'll probably like it a little bit more if you're a fan already of the Mass Effect franchise. But ultimately, this game isn't as good as many other games that have been released recently. This game is not as good as the original Mass Effect trilogy, in my opinion, and that's a bad sign for someone who's trying to reboot a franchise and put it out into the modern era and start up a new plot line and even have a big cliffhanger ending like this game had, saying that obviously they want to make a sequel. When the internet is pretty much collectively making fun of your game for its shortcomings, that's not a good thing. And sadly, Andromeda is not living up to sales expectations because of this. It sucks because I love the Mass Effect franchise, and I almost wish that maybe this game hadn't come out, and maybe there was another different game in its place, because I want to see this franchise succeed, and this game honestly was very underwhelming. It's not going to be a Game of the Year contender for me by far, and I hopefully wish that they do better next time, if there is a next time. That's it for my review, everyone. I hope that you enjoyed it, and if you did, please consider subscribing here to KO Gaming, where there'll be many more of these kind of review later on this year for all the biggest new AAA releases, as well as some smaller ones as well. Also, please consider giving this video in particular a like here on YouTube, and also please check out the description of the video for links to things such as my raw playthrough of Mass Effect Andromeda over on my DSP Gaming channel, as well as links to my Twitch TV streaming channel, where the entirety of the playthrough was streamed daily throughout the month of March and April. You can also check out things like my Loot Crate discount and affiliate links. You can also check out my Teespring store. There's a bunch of fun stuff in the description of the video, so please give it a look. As always, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time right here on KO Gaming.